Welcome to Ministries, the podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Amy Gannett. She's the founder and creator of the podcast Tiny Theologians. We're going to talk about the story of her starting the ministry and then later the podcast, the inspiration behind their unique podcast format, and what it takes to create an episode of a scripted podcast with voice actors. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Amy Gannett. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I think I first came across Tiny Theologians probably around the time I was starting this podcast and trying to find other ministry leaders that were using podcasting as part of their ministry efforts. And I think I remember seeing back at that time that you were launching a podcast and it hadn't come out yet. I think it was going to publish in the fall, which oddly enough is the same time that I was publishing this podcast. And so I had put your name down on the list and glad that we finally got you on the show. But you launched Tiny Theologians in August of 2023. And then a brief summary of the show for context for those listening that might not be familiar is this adventure podcast for kids is fun, upbeat, and rich with biblical theology. Each week, kids can join TJ and Tori as they go on more big adventures exploring God's big world and learning all about his character. So, Amy, I'm glad to have you on the show today to hear about your podcasting journey, but let's go back to the very beginning and tell me about how the ministry of Tiny Theologians got started.
Yeah, the ministry of Tiny Theologians has been around a lot longer than the podcast has.
Yeah.
We have 8 years under our belts now as one of the, by God's grace, and we consider it a really big stewardship, but one of the leading brands that is creating discipleship resources for kids. Now from age 0 up through age 14. We started with just a single set of flashcards, hoping to capture some early elementary age kids. We started with what we called the Tiny Theologians flashcards. Now we call them the ABCs of Theology. But from there, it just became very obvious to us that there was a hunger for this kind of content that was theologically rich for kids, that didn't moralize scripture, didn't water it down, didn't make every Bible character into a hero, but really taught kids about who Jesus is, did biblical theology at a kid level and in kid language. And so we started doing that a handful of years ago now. And then the opportunity to produce a podcast has actually come along many times. But when joining the church, the network that produces Knowing Faith and other shows, when they approached us about partnering with us, it just felt like the right time. It was the Lord saying, now's the time to pursue something like this. So we started producing the show as a way of reaching families who might be looking for a zero entry access into discipleship. The podcast is free. And it is theologically rich, and it's a great way to engage kids when you're not sure if they'll sit down and do flashcards. You're not sure how you develop discipleship routines as a family. It's a great way to start something when you aren't sure what to start. So that's how the podcast came into the picture just all those years later.
Nice. Yeah. So I was listening to an interview that you did on
Knowing Faith.
Knowing Faith. I almost said Knowing Truth, and I was like, that's not right.
They got some truth on that show too.
Yeah, on Knowing Faith. And you mentioned that you'd been thinking about starting a podcast years before you actually did, but it had kind of been put on the back burner. Tell me a little bit about that and what led to the right time to start the podcast that then launched in 2023.
Well, a lot of the opportunities that arose prior to that were opportunities to do a podcast that was geared towards adults, raising Tiny Theologians. So something that would encourage parents, which I think is great, but there's a lot of stuff out there like that. And my goal has always been to make learning about God fun for kids, because I think if kids are having a great time learning about God and doing it alongside their parents, they're going to be one of the drivers of discipleship in their homes without even knowing it. They're going to say, can we sit down and do our flashcards? Can we do those mealtime discussion questions? Whose turn is it to pull a card out of the box? They're going to be some of the drivers. And so I never really wanted to produce a show that was all about geared towards parents, And truth be told, I am a mom. I'm a mom of 3 kids, But my oldest is just entering kindergarten. Like, I don't have a lot of tried and true, long-term tested parenting advice. I just didn't have that. I still don't have that. I'm still looking for it. So that wasn't the kind of show I wanted to create. But what I really wanted to do was do something for kids, something that was fresh and imaginative, that was an adventure. I wanted to take kids along for the ride and along for the adventure. There were some podcasts at the time that were examples sent to me. We could do something like this with Tiny Theologians. And while they were so good, they talked at kids. They told them about whatever, about the fruit of the Spirit, about the armor of God, talking at them. And that has so much value. But the age range that I wanted to reach was just younger. They just don't tolerate being talked at very much. And so I wanted something that was shoulder to shoulder with kids, brought them into the story. And so when the Knowing Faith crew approached me about it, they basically gave me the freedom to write whatever kind of show I wanted to write. And so it was the first opportunity where this idea that I had sort of been stewing on for quite a while, knowing the type of show I wanted to do, the format of it I wanted to do. I didn't have TJ and Tori as characters in my head, but I knew I wanted kids adventuring through a neighborhood, exploring the attributes of God. When they approached me and said, hey, you can do whatever you want, write the show that you want to exist, that just felt like the green light. I prayed about the opportunity, and felt like a green light from the Lord saying, now's the time to make this plan happen.
Nice. Yeah. And in that same episode that I was referencing, you actually described the podcast as Mr. Rogers meets Adventures in Odyssey meets a systematic theology book. So how did you decide on those pieces and putting that together and then bringing those characters to life?
Yeah, maybe I should explain what I mean by each of those pieces.
Yeah, sure.
By Mr. Rogers, well, let me go with Adventures in Odyssey first, because most of my audience would be more familiar with that, I guess. I grew up on Adventures in Odyssey.
Yeah, same.
Feel like it raised me a little bit. Mr. Whitaker was my hero growing up. And so I wanted something like that. Adventures in Odyssey is still around. And it sort of had that story flow. You were invited into the narrative. It was very imaginative. And so I wanted that. I wanted familiar characters, voices kids could come to know and trust. And Adventures in Odyssey does a great job of teaching biblical principles and how to apply those to everyday life. So I wanted some of that, but I wanted to take it a little bit of a different direction and do some theology. I wanted kids to ask and answer big questions about who God is, not just how do we live it out, not just what do we do in everyday life to live as Christians, which is a really important topic for kids. But I felt like Adventures in Odyssey was doing that. Other shows were doing that. I wanted it to do some of the heavy lifting of who is God? What does it mean that he is unchanging? What does it mean that he has attributes that are communicable to us and incommunicable that belong only to himself? I wanted to do some of that for kids. And so that's what I mean by Adventures in Odyssey.
Yeah.
And by a systematic theology, I wanted that systematic theology textbook to show up in the world of adventure for kids. And then Mr. Rogers, I love Mr. Rogers. One of the things I love about Mr. Rogers is that as a character who is teaching, as somebody who is literally teaching the people that are watching his show, he is not wagging his finger at them and saying, I hope you remember this, get this right, that sort of thing. No, he is so encouraging and so affirming. He's telling kids that he's proud of them as they're learning. And I think that that's the tone of the Holy Spirit speaking to kids, saying, I want you to know me. That's the voice of God in all of Scripture. I gave you all of my word. I gave you all of Scripture so that you might know me and know me personally. And it's an invitation. It's not a shaming, boring, dull, remember this, like memorize the Bible verse. It's not strict and harsh and aggressive and abrasive in that way. I wanted it to be encouraging, and I wanted to incorporate music so that kids would have this real sense of remembering Scripture, but remembering it because it was stuck in their heads because they wanted to, not because somebody was saying, you should just remember this Q&A. So that's how those pieces came together. And I think we've gotten something close to that. I think the show is a little bit of Mr. Rogers, a little bit of Adventures in Odyssey, a little bit systematic theology workbook.
Nice. Yeah. And you said that you didn't specifically have the idea for TJ and Tori at the beginning, but that's what it developed into. And then you added the music element to it. Tell us about how those pieces came together to be what the episodes are today.
I wish I could say that I had a really methodical approach to developing those characters. I didn't. It's sort of an organic process for me. I sat down and said, who could some of these characters be? The TJ and Tori as a brother and sister came out of a principle that I wanted to teach in the show.
Mm.
And that is about collaboration between siblings and friendship between siblings. I wanted to demonstrate different age levels. So TJ is presumably about preschool age, so he's not reading level. I wanted to demonstrate for kids who can't read that they can know God through his word, even though they're not literate yet. Tori is school age, and so she gets off the school bus every day. I wanted to demonstrate for students who go to school, whether it be private, Christian school, public school, homeschool co-op, that when they go somewhere, the challenges that they face with peers, even with homework, can inspire them to ask big questions about who God is and who he's made them to be. So I knew I wanted characters in those two different categories, and that I wanted them to be my main characters, and I wanted the whole neighborhood to support their adventures. So I wanted people at different age levels, different occupations. So we have the neighbors that live, presumably directly next to TJ and Tori are built off of my neighbors, our next door neighbors that my girls know and love. They're in their 80s. They speak to our kids with so much kindness and compassion, show them their garden all the time. So when I'm writing Mr. and Mrs. Wiseman, who often point the kids in the ways of God's wisdom, as I'm writing their characters, I'm picturing my neighbors in their backyard and the tone of voice and the hobbies that they have, that sort of thing. I wanted people with occupations that would be coming to the house. So Miss D Livery, the delivery driver, I wanted her coming to the house because you need characters who move, right? So you need characters that they'll run into, like their neighbors might be outside, they might not be. But you need characters that are mobile. So Miss D Livery, Mr. Reed, the neighborhood dog walker, those are characters that can come by the house in a natural way and they can interact with. I wanted a place that they could go that kids love to be. So a farm. We have Farmer Caroline. TJ and Tori go on field trips to Farmer Caroline's farm often, or the parents will take them to pick up produce at the farmer's market and they run into her there. I wanted kids to think that learning is fun, because it is, because being a little bit nerdy and getting a little bit nerdy about God's word in particular is really exciting. There's a lot to discover and explore. And so I wanted there to be a neighborhood library. So I built that into the neighborhood. And so Miss Libby is the librarian there. And then we needed a way to bring music into every episode, because every episode sort of ends with a song that answers the question that they're looking for. And so Mr. Truman, the town troubadour, is very mobile. He's in every corner of the neighborhood. They always run into him. And actually, I was recording with the two kids. They're actually a brother and sister who play TJ and Tori.
Nice.
I was recording with the girl, and at one point, she's older than Tori is in the show. Tori's, maybe second or third grade, and she's a fifth grader. And she was like, "Why does Mr. Truman show up at the end of every single show?" I was like, "Well, that's just how this works. That's like how the actual show is going to work the whole time, But because of that, it just made it really... he can show up. He's mobile. He can show up wherever the characters are. So that's how I landed on the neighborhood as it is, and the characters wrote them the way that I wrote them.
Yeah. So where did you, come up with the idea for the music as a piece to tie everything together at the end, as well as find somebody to do that?
Well, how I came up with it is just science. Kids learn best by doing and moving, and music brings a lot of those things together. So it also is just, if you're talking audio learning formats for kids, music is number one. If you're only talking in terms of audio and you don't have any visuals, you got to go music for kids. That's how they remember stuff. And so I knew I wanted every episode to include music. And actually, as soon as I thought of that, I thought this podcast just got very expensive, because what I'm talking about is writing custom music for every single episode. A little bit of the backstory of the podcast is I thought we would launch A through Z, 2 seasons, and we would say, wasn't that a wonderful time? You can listen to these A through Z anytime you want. They're just going to be evergreen content. They'll just be out there, but thank you for your time. So when I first approached my friend, Kent Henderson, who writes all the music, and he plays Mr. Truman, he actually plays all the male vocals. He does all the male characters. When I approached him about doing it, I was like, we're only talking, 26. We can do this together. I can help write the lyrics. You can write the music. You can put it to song, that sort of thing. It was like, that feels so doable, so exciting, that sort of thing. And of course, nearing the end of every season, I'm like, how do you feel about 26 more? You got 26 more in you. Let's do the alphabet again. But Kent Henderson is the worship pastor at our sending church. My husband and I are church planters here in Greenville, North Carolina. We planted Trinity Church Greenville several years ago. My husband, Austin, serves as a pastor, and I serve as the director of discipleship.
Nice.
And our sending church is Grace Fellowship Church in Kinston, which is just on the road. And so Kent is the worship pastor there. We have a relationship from our years spent in ministry there. And when I thought of who could take on this role, because it is a unique role, there were a couple of things that were really important to me. One, somebody who can logistically write a song and sing it, and they don't sound terrible. But I really wasn't looking for like the best musician. Now, Kent is super talented. So I'm not saying that that wasn't a highlight of his skill set, because it is. But I wasn't looking for somebody who was like a professional musician. I was looking for somebody who could do the logistical work of recording and playing the instruments, composing a song, because not every singer is a songwriter. Composition's a unique thing. But also somebody who was just good with kids in their own personal life. Kent has 5 kids. And the thing that I love about Kent is that in real life, I've witnessed him with kids. He's goofy. He's super comfortable in his own skin. He makes kids feel comfortable too. And there's something about learning about God that for a kid that is already like feeling they're growing more self-conscious about the questions that they might have or whatever, we just need somebody who can put them at ease. And that really comes through how you talk to kids. If you're uncomfortable, if you're awkward being goofy as an adult, you better guarantee that they can smell it out and they feel uncomfortable too. And all of a sudden, the thing that you're talking about is awkward. So I really wanted somebody who was really comfortable in their own skin, somebody who could be goofy, because I didn't want to impress upon kids like, oh, this topic is, because that's how kids would interpret it. And we're talking about God. We're talking about foundational doctrines of the church. So Kent was really the right fit for me. And I also just love that I know him. We can get together and record together when we want to, stuff like that. Like the Lord just laid it out. He was just the exact right person to work with.
Nice. So tell me a little bit about this development process of, okay, you have the idea, you have these 2 kids and you're building out the neighborhood and then you're going to have this song element. How long did it take from going from I have this idea to actually getting to that first episode?
What we decided to do, I had never written a script before for audio production. So I said, let me try my hand at, we have to try 4 is what I felt like was a good trial number. 4 episodes. That's right. A through D. And honestly, let's just see if we were basing it off of the ABCs of God's attributes flashcards. And what we wanted to do is, let's see if this content translates into a script.
Sure,
let's see if these characters can be developed. Let's see what can happen. And so as that happened, I wrote 4 scripts, and then I started sourcing the voice actors for the different roles and stuff like that. And the whole time it was like, let's see if this works, So we all kind of got together on one weekend day and tried to record. We were like, let's try to record these 4 episodes. And you know what? We ran into a lot of hiccups that we did not realize. We're like, well, okay, that didn't work. That does work, that sort of thing. And then we sent it off to the editor and said, can you just produce a demo for us of letter A? Produce letter A. The podcast episodes are only like 10 to 12 minutes. Some are like 9 to 13 minutes, something like that. So I was like, let's just go ahead and pay for one demo, see how it comes together. And I remember when it landed in my inbox, my husband and I were still like, we're not totally sure if this is something, we have seen, it's like looking at your pantry and seeing all of the ingredients. I think this can make something delicious, but it's not, we haven't tasted it yet. It's just all ingredients and we put it in the oven and we're not sure what's going to come out yet. And I remember sitting in the living room with him while our girls were running around. It was the Christmas season. Our Christmas tree was up. Our girls were running around the living room. And my husband and I were listening to the demo in about 2 minutes. And we looked at each other and we're like, this is something. This is actually going to work. And so we decided to produce the rest of those 4 episodes. We changed our recording format. So we were going to record all in one room. Characters, let the energy bounce off each other. Well, you know what's really hard about that? Kids. Kids have a really hard time with that. There's too much distraction. It's too exciting, actually. And so we decided to back it up. And kids have a hard time reading. They're also young readers. And so when they read a script, it sounds like they're reading. It sounds like they are sounding out every word on the page. And so that's not what we wanted. So it's like, well, this isn't working. So how do we change that? So we actually changed our format of recording. What we decided to do instead was the kids come to my house. They come to where I record the podcast and we do reflective reading. So I read them a line off mic the way I want them to read it, and then they echo it. They don't look at a script. They have no words in front of them. They just listen to the ebb and flow of my voice, the intonation, and then they record it into the mic. And so we do even sentences or half sentences of recording, and then our editor goes ahead and puts everything together. So Kent records all of his male vocal lines and sends them to the editor. And Amy, not myself, another Amy, does all the female vocals, and she records all of her female vocal lines and sends them to the editor. And then TJ and Tori, they each record all of their lines with me in that reflective reading way, and we send them on, and they weave them together to make an episode.
Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of pieces that come together to make those episodes, and then all the other elements in there with sound effects and the music. So it probably takes, I'm guessing, quite a bit of time to go from writing the script to getting a finished episode. What does that timeline kind of look like?
I write the episodes. I write them 2 seasons at a time. So I write A through Z because it usually has like some cohesive story elements. Sure. So the kids are growing up and you want them to sort of have this complete experience from at least A through M, which is 1 season, and then N through Z. So I write them all at once. And then when we get together to record, we record A through Z and send them to the editor. And then the editor works them through A, B, C that way and sends them to us as they're complete. But I would say, so we just finished recording, well, we're almost finished recording the next 2 seasons, seasons 5 and 6. And the writing process has gotten much quicker for me. It used to be that I could write a single episode in like 4 hours. It would take me 4 hours in the morning to write an episode. And I'm a mom. I'm a stay-at-home mom with 3 little ones, and I work 1 day a week. I work on Mondays. That's when we're recording this podcast because it's the only day I have childcare. And honestly, it's the only day I want to work. I want to be with my kids. That's why I do what I do, so that I can be with them throughout the week. So it was taking me about half of a workday to write 1 episode. But as the gears were kind of greased and as my creative juices sort of got flowing, I was able to write 4 episodes in 1 writing day, like when I would set aside a morning to write. So now it takes me about an hour to write an episode, and it takes us anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to record with each character. So I'll record with each kid. I'll record the mom lines, that sort of thing. Those are all happening kind of simultaneously. And then I send it to the editors. So I would say in this season, it's taken me about 6 weeks to write all of season 5 and 6. Yeah. It's taken us a couple of weeks to coordinate getting everybody on the mics and recorded. But then we'll be done for almost a year, which is kind of great. Seasons 5 and 6 will just be edited and posted as they're ready.
Nice. Yeah. So seasons 5 and 6 then publish, am I right, this fall and then the spring?
In the spring. Yeah. So it'll be September through May.
Nice. Yeah. And that's how you formatted the past 2 seasons, which went through the attributes of God and then I believe the names of God. So I'd love to know, what's seasons 5 and 6 going to be about?
Seasons 5 and 6 are following the ABCs of theology. So we have a best-selling product in the Tiny Theologians store, and it's the ABC bundle, which has 3 sets of ABC cards: the ABCs of God's attributes, which were season 1 and 2, the ABCs of the names of God, which were seasons 3 and 4, and the ABCs of theology, which will be seasons 5 and 6. So we're excited about this one. It covers much more robust theological concepts than the attributes of God or the names of God have previously. It was the biggest challenge for me to write, because we're not just talking about how God is all-knowing, which is perfect for a preschooler to learn, but in the ABCs of theology, A is for atonement, B is for baptism, C is for communion, D is for doctrine. I mean, we're taking some heavy-hitting concepts. So we're going deep, but I think we're doing it in a way that grows with our audience. You know, our audience that started with us 2 years ago that was in preschool, they're going into 1st and 2nd grade now. So they're ready for some of these conversations about baptism and about communion, to learn what doctrine is, that sort of thing. So I'm really excited about it.
So So, one thing I've noticed about the brand is that you're very thoughtful about how it's all brought together. And one of those ways is with the podcast art, using the logo and adapting it to create a face with headphones and then plugging that into the word podcast underneath. Tell me a little bit about how that idea came together.
I actually am not totally sure how that idea came to be. We were working with a designer. I had a designer that was part-time on my team at the time. And I was like, I know what I want. I just have no idea how to accomplish it. And I knew I wanted it to be the Tiny Theologians podcast. You know, we had thrown around, do we call it TJ and Tori's Bible Story Adventures? Like, do we?
Sure.
Honestly, most of our audience calls it something different. They don't call it the Tiny Theologians podcast. Most of them call it, most kids go to their parents and say, I want to listen to TJ and Tori. That's what my own offspring, that's what they call it. Can I listen to TJ and Tori? But I wanted it from a brand recognition standpoint to be just the Tiny Theologians podcast, because I think that gives us some flexibility if we want to do something different in the future.
Sure.
You know, at a certain point, here's a reality of podcasting. With kids, we don't use AI for our kids' vocals, and I feel pretty resolved in that. But they're growing up. You know, the kid who plays a preschooler, he's going into 4th grade. Like, his voice is going to change. Like, we just have a clock on this exact storyline.
Totally.
There's a time limit on it. And so that's a reality of podcasting. But I knew I wanted the brand to be front and center. And we already have a face built into the Tiny Theologians logo. And so I thought, how can we differentiate it? We can put headphones on it because it's showing that they are listening to something. And then we added podcast to the bottom, which I liked. And then I said, can we make it like a neon sign? Like it's like flashing and lighting up. And we actually have a GIF. You know, when we announced the podcast, we like had this GIF of like the neon flashing, like it was shorting out and then turning on.
Nice, yeah.
And so, I don't know how it came to me, but I basically like kept coming back to my designer and being like, work with me here. Like this idea keeps unfolding, and it became something that I really love.
Nice. Yeah, so part of the brand is, and really kind of how it was set out to be at the beginning before the podcast even came along, was these different resources and products that families could use with their kids. And so you have baby blankets and card sets and puzzles and workbooks. How has the podcast been a great addition to those resources that you were already creating?
Yeah, I think for families that want to try our resources, I mean, all of our resources, you mentioned baby blankets, is that we've just added those recently to the shop. But most of our stuff and almost all of our core products, 90% of our stuff is pretty theologically heavy hitting. And so for families that are new to our brand, I totally understand being like, what's your brand all about? How are you going to talk about these things? And is it going to align with how I want to talk to my kids about God? And so I wanted something that kind of gave parents a sample of how we talk about these things, which is why the podcast is free and, you know, will be, because I want it to be sort of this entry-level thing for families. So I don't know that it's affected products so much as I think it's given parents more confidence to put their dollars into something, to invest in something, knowing kind of the tone in which we talk about things. But the other thing is it's grown our audience because we're a theology brand. Initially, the families that kind of gravitated towards our brand were families that took their faith really seriously, which is still the case. We still have a lot of families that are like using just even to use terms like theology, you have to be pretty dedicated to things of faith, especially if you're thinking about teaching theology to your kids. Like you're pretty knee deep in things of the faith. But the podcast has really brought along a lot of first-generation Christian families.
Nice.
And that, to me, is so exciting.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever done one of those spiritual gift assessments, you know?
Yeah, it's been a long time, but
yeah, it's been a long time for me, too. But I went through Bible school, went through seminary, and they make you assess these things all the time.
Sure.
But I am always, one of my top spiritual gifts is evangelism. Love evangelism. Like, I love knowing that people are coming into the faith and being a part of that. And so when I see new believers catching on to the fact that they can teach their kids about the faith that is new to them, even though they don't have a model from having grown up with that.
Yeah,
They're not
yeah.
like you and I, who said, I grew up listening to Adventures in Odyssey, so I have a
Yeah,
concept
right.
of what it would look like to have an adventure story in which somebody learns a biblical truth. They don't have those same concepts in mind because they didn't grow up with it before their eyes. But if we can put a tool in their hands that gives them even some basic sample interactions between parents and kids, what do you do? It was really important to me. So here's something coming up in seasons 5 and 6. 2 things were really important to me that I wanted to model for first-generation Christian families. One is, what do you do when your kid asks you a question and you actually don't know the answer? Because that happens all the time, especially if you're a new believer and you're raising your kids in the faith. They're learning right alongside you. So what do you do when you're not the parent who has all the theological answers? So one of the parents in seasons 5 and 6 is going to say, I actually don't know, but let's go find out together. Let's look at God's word together. Let's explore this together. The other thing I wanted to model for first-generation Christian parents or parents who just weren't raised with this model is I wanted the parents to have to ask forgiveness for wronging one of their children. Like, I spoke to you in anger. Will you please forgive me? Modeling that, what we've had the kids do. The kids have had to apologize for disobeying their parents. But you know what? The inverse is true. We as parents often will respond in the heat of a moment or snap or tell kids, give them an instruction or something and go, wait a second. I wish I would have handled that differently. And I'm really sorry. I should have spoken to you with gentleness. I'm going to name what I did wrong. I'm going to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did. I'm going to ask for your forgiveness and I'm going to receive the grace of your forgiveness. And so I want to model those things. Just sort of, that's the Mr. Rogers part of the show, right? Where we're putting on display before families. Here's some sort of acted out scenes of what this could look like to give parents an imagination of one other way that a Christian home might look. It's not the right way. It's not the only way. But for parents that go, I don't have any way in mind, like I don't have a concept in hand of what it could look like to have a Christian home, man, I really just want to give parents something to hold on to. One example. There's going to be so many good ones out there, but here's one example of one way that it could look for your family.
Nice. Yeah. So I'm curious, what other opportunities have come out of having a podcast that you've been able to be a part of or engage in that you maybe wouldn't have had if you didn't have a podcast as part of your brand?
Well, I'm not sure that we've had a lot of new opportunities. Now, the podcast, I feel like, could still grow. So I feel like the opportunities for audio production have really presented themselves. And now I'm starting to think, what would it look like to branch off the show and do something different? I'm very mid-process on that. No idea what kind of decisions I'm going to make. But I do think one of the things that it's shown me is just how hungry people are for audio content and how hungry parents are to have audio content for their kids, especially if there's a way that they can play it ad-free or play it offline without handing them their phone. We made our podcast, we did like a tutorial on our website for parents to put the RSS link on a Yodo card so that kids could play it offline and they could play it without their parents handing them their phone or an iPad or something like that. And wow, we were floored by how hungry parents were for that kind of content. So I think there will be more opportunities in the future that present themselves to continue producing audio content. We're not sure what that will be yet, but it just shows me people are really hungry for it. And when you talk in terms of like consuming content, and when you're talking about kids, it's either going to be print material or audio material. You can create like audio visual material. You can create a show, but even so many more parents are hesitant about screens for their little ones. I feel the same way. I'm very hesitant about screens for my kids. And so even within the realm of what parents want to put before their kids, audio is just a really growing area. And so I'm curious to see where it'll take us in the future.
Nice. Yeah, for sure. You mentioned at the beginning that the podcast is part of the podcast network, Training the Church. What's been the benefit of being a part of a podcast network like that?
Yeah, we actually just announced our departure from Training the Church for no bad reasons. Like, we're just everybody's growing and it's just time for us to I literally told that team, we actually need to see if we can stand on our own two legs. I got to try it. I don't know if I can, but I got to try. And so we're ending things on really good terms with them. Love those folks. We'll always be cheering them on. But because I kind of want the flexibility to take the show in different directions if I want to, it just felt like the right time. So at the end of this year is when we'll officially part ways, with a lot of hugs and high fives on both sides. But launching was so wonderful with a network. Honestly, I wasn't even that big of a podcast listener. I didn't even consume that many. And I definitely didn't consume any kids' podcast shows. So I was just I don't know anything about this. So I don't know how to find a good editor. I don't know how to source ads. And so they brought this infrastructure that was just so helpful in getting started. It's sort of the difference between somebody who says, I know how to code, I'm going to build my own website, and somebody who goes to a website building platform like WordPress or Squarespace or whatever they use. And it's just oh, you've made this to be user-friendly. You set up some systems that just help it be smoother sailing for somebody who's a newbie like me. So that was really wonderful. And they were just such encouragements. They've become good friends. I love having conversations with them about podcasting and thinking about what could be next for the show. They're just great encouragers. They share our ministry heart. We really want to serve families. This isn't just a business. It is a ministry, but also it's a ministry that needs to be sustainable. So we need to talk numbers. We need to look at it. So they have that real balance. We share a lot in common in our approach to podcasting. So I found real camaraderie with them in that way.
Nice. Yeah. So as you look back on the 2 years that you've been in podcasting at this point, how has having a podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it's brought in a new demographic of families, but it's also helped me really understand the topics that parents have the hardest time teaching to their kids. And so it's helped me hone in on one of the gifts that I think that God has given me, which is kind of the basis of the Tiny Theologians brand, is how do we take the toughest theological topics and make them not watered down, not moralized, but easily accessible in kid-friendly language. True, but simple. That's what we want to do. And so as we stumble across some of those topics that become the most difficult for parents to talk about, we've actually found that baptism and communion are two topics that parents have a really hard time talking with their kids about. Even things like, how do I assess if my kid is ready to be baptized? I've heard their story. I know they accepted Jesus as their savior at VBS or summer camp or something like that. But how do I really know? Walking through some of those things is sort of our secret sauce. There's some true gifting for our team in creating resources that help with that. So the podcast has really helped highlight for us which topics parents are grappling with the most, and then helped us say, okay, how do we resource you in a way that really serves your family well?
Yeah, that's a great part about podcasting is, and specifically that feedback from putting out different types of content and going through a bunch of different things. Then you can get that feedback back and, oh, we need to dive into this, or, this really performed well. So we need to figure out what the best next step for listeners. So that's fantastic. All right. Well, what are you excited about for the future of Tiny Theologians?
Well, our brand continues to serve everyday, ordinary families. And so I'm really excited about what we're launching for this Advent. We're creating one of my favorite resources ever, hands down, ever, for families to look at Christ together throughout the holiday season. And it's going to involve the podcast. So I'm super excited about that. It's the first time that we're making discipleship resource for families to use in the home that is strategically built to go along with the podcast. So I'm thrilled about that. But I'm also excited about the future. We continue to just say yes to the opportunities God puts in front of us. And we don't know what the next thing is for the Tiny Theologians podcast. We don't know where the story is going to grow, but we feel really optimistic that in his time, in his way, he'll show us what that next step is. And we're excited to say yes when he does.
Nice. All right. Well, let's jump into the high pass segment now, where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So first question, what's your favorite hobby right now?
I am a crafter. So I don't know who said this originally, but if you work with your mind, you rest with your hands. So I recently have taken up quilting. And I really enjoy making quilts for my kids.
Nice.
And I am just now getting into amateur pottery type stuff. So
fun. What's the favorite thing that you've made so far with pottery?
Well, so far, nothing. Nothing is my favorite so far. But
Okay.
I am really excited I have like some thoughts about what I want to do for some Christmas gifts for family members and
Nice.
stuff like that. I love being bad at something. And so I'm really bad at it right now. But that has actually kind of a fun part of the process for me.
Yeah.
So nothing's my
Nice.
favorite yet, but that doesn't mean that by Christmas, there won't be something that I'm really proud of.
Nice. What's been your favorite activity to do as a family this summer?
Well, we just moved. Our family just moved into a new house, and we have just been settling in, which has been great. But we are exploring a new neighborhood. And so going on family walks and letting the kids ride their bikes and walking together as a family has been really, really fun.
Nice. Yeah. All right. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how the Tiny Theologians podcast has impacted their life?
This may not be the best example, but I'm going to tell you, this is one that comes to mind all the time. It actually came from a negative podcast review of all things. But somebody wrote in complaining about the fact that their kid was singing God is All-Knowing, which is a song for letter A from God's attributes, over and over and over again, and that it was very annoying. And I just remember thinking, like, God bless that kid going through the house singing about how God is all-knowing to the point where their parent is like, stop, like it just was this confirmation. It came very early in our podcasting experience. We had just maybe even made it through season 1, maybe.
Yeah.
But at that point, it was just sort of like, it's catching on. The thing that we wanted it to do for it to take root in kids' hearts and lives and minds, it's doing. Like, look, this kid is addicted to singing God is all-knowing, to the point where the parent found our email address and wrote us about how much their kid was singing the song. Like, that takes so much repetition. So I was like, it's happening.
Yeah.
It's doing it. It's doing its job.
That's great. All right, well, Amy, as we close, who else do you know that would be a great guest for this podcast?
That's a great question. So my friend Holly has just started a new show called Unseriously. And she interviews notable normals, is what she says. So her show is Join Me As I Ask Quirky Questions of Notable Normals. So she interviews people mostly in the Christian space, but people who do like write books. And she was like, yeah, we've heard about your book. You've done the podcast circuit for your book, but tell me about the worst date you've ever been on. So that's a really fun idea. Like when I get a lot of not a lot, but like a lot of podcast interview requests that are very similar. They're all in the same category, especially if we launch something, it's like about that something, And here, Holly's request, and Holly and I have met, so we know each other personally, that sort of thing. But I was like, this is totally different. And so as somebody being interviewed, it was so fun. And I go and listen to the friends that I have. Like I've made internet buddies with a lot of the other authors that she's had on. And I'm like, well, I want to hear about their worst date. Like I want to hear those stories. So she would be a really fun one to talk to.
Nice. Well, thank you for that recommendation. And thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today and share your podcasting journey. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Amy about creating their unique podcast format and what it takes to produce engaging episodes for kids. You can listen to the Tiny Theologians podcast with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Will and Miki Addison. They're the creators behind the podcast and YouTube channel Culture Proof, where they practically equip Christians to resist the cultural trends that rival the truth. We're going to talk about their careers in radio and the transition to podcasting, what they know now that they wish they would have known when they started the podcast, and the challenge of refusing to chase views and listens. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.